as we navigate through this global pandemic, and seeing that as a very useful tool for revenue mobilization, not just now, but going forward, about taxing in that space, about policy, both here locally in the country, as well as in the region. Now, our next session is just as exciting. And so let me just remind you once again of the house rules. Please put your phones on silent. Also remember, we're having this conversation with you here, socially distanced, masked up, as well as all of you who are joining us virtually. Remember, you can still register. We're here for yet another day and a half or so. So please do so, summit.kra.go.ke. Also engage with us online at Twitter, at Facebook, and on YouTube. We are live. And if you want to tweet some of the wisdom and insights that are being shared here, please use the hashtag TaxSummit2020 for your questions as well. Remember, we're also taking questions from you through our Zoom chat platform. We'll be getting those and we'll be posing them to our panelists for the next session. Now, this is indeed a very interesting one. We're taking a look at innovative approaches to sustain economies in the COVID-19 era. It's the next normal. It's the new normal. It's building back better. All of these are some of the issues that we are going to be taking a look at. And one of the important questions that we're going to be answering, we'll be taking a look at how COVID-19 has affected global fiscal policies. We'll be taking a look at how we can continue to generate income whilst still protecting the health of workers, because that is the important conundrum we find ourselves in, that containment measures are important in curbing the spread of COVID-19, but yet that very containment restricts economic activity. So how do you find a healthy balance between the two? And indeed, taking a look at what's happening globally as well, how it has hampered the free movement of people, goods, and services, and what is happening on the global scene, the global reaction. And so in line with that, it is my pleasure to invite the keynote speaker for this session, a man who is known very well, not just in the country, but globally as well. One of Kenya's best exports, and is a man we are truly and deeply proud of, a man who's got some extensive background and experience. He's been in elective office, in academia, a holder of high government office, very experienced in trade negotiations and in international economics and diplomacy. Prior to his current position, he was the chief executive of the Kenya Institute of Governance based here in Nairobi. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm African welcome to Dr. Mukisa Kitui. He is the Secretary General of UNCTAD, that's the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Welcome very much, Daktari.
Thank you very much, moderator, the chairman, the board, Ambassador Mudaura, the entire leadership, management, and staff of the Kenya Revenue Authority, participants in this session remotely joining us from around the country. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me substantial pleasure to be able to join you and think aloud around the challenges of dealing with the challenges arising from the COVID and reflecting on what can be Kenya's path to recovering better. I will start with a few reflections on some of the work we've been doing as an international institution that has been monitoring patterns in global impact of COVID, economics of COVID. But also emphasizing what are the pre-existing conditions that have been exacerbated by the COVID. Because we cannot pretend that the challenges we have to deal with to build better have all arisen since the arrival of COVID. Indeed, to my mind, some of the biggest challenges we face for recovering is that COVID just made worse some fairly difficult choices that have to be made. 2-3 areas are important in this. The first one is globally the rise of economic nationalism and the possibilities of automation and robotics were already disrupting global production networks, dramatically affecting production networks, global value chains, global service chains, in a way that was impacting the possibilities of industrial policy in most developing countries of the world. As it were, COVID has only exacerbated the problem where the traditional niches that the industrial policy of most developing countries was to identify, has always been, identify a set of activities that you can get into on international production networks, skill up and scale up. What has happened over the past few years with the rising technology cold war between China and the US and the resultant disruptions of global supply networks, we have seen either reshoring of businesses, manufacturing, particularly investment in services, or regionalizing, shortening the value chains to the neighborhoods of destination markets. One of the consequences of this has been a very dramatic change in the patterns of multinational enterprise in investments abroad. But immediately for many developing countries like Kenya and most of Africa, the fact that the niche that they were growing through industrial policies like export processing zones, special economic zones, disrupted by mostly geopolitically driven alterations to supply networks, has created uncertainty about the models of how you are going to recover on the basis of industrialization. Eventually, I want to argue that there is no alternative to industrial policy if you are talking about long-term recovery in a vulnerable economy. We have seen a global scramble for new resources to deal with the pandemic and its related consequences on the economy. Globally, we have seen about $12 trillion in fiscal action, mainly unleashed by the G20 leading economies of the world, accounting for about 12% of global GDP. Unfortunately, in developing countries with limited fiscal space, the intervention level has been limited to less than 2% of GDP. And even then, there has been major challenge on how to balance between sustaining enterprise and sustaining livelihoods. These are the core of the rationale that some institutions, actually led by my own organization and eventually supported by IMF and other international institutions, were moving for enhanced special drawing rights, indicatively to $1 trillion US, and reallocation of existing special drawing rights from countries that do not need it to the countries most in need, both poor and emerging economies. Similarly, the challenges associated with this disruptive demand for the economics of health service provision and the economic downturn globally, contraction everywhere in GDP because of the pandemic, has been a major challenge, seeing the rising wall of debt vulnerability in developing countries. Countries in Africa have been very dependent on what they get on the multinational enterprise subsidiaries as a major source of taxation. Across Africa, the average is 15% of government tax revenue comes from the subsidiaries of multinational enterprises. But if you look at many of the cases, the multiplier effect, the supplier networks to those multinational enterprises drive out the role of those enterprises in some territories up to 50% of actually collected tax, which suggests that if there is any downturn in the activities of multinational enterprises, if there is disruption in their production and market access, if there is a relocation driven by politics to other destinations, the already dire situation is substantially augmented with uncertainty. How do we situate now countries like Kenya in that kind of situation, in this kind of context globally? A number of things are important. First, that the uncertainty of enterprises is a major challenge to the stability and predictability of revenue sources. Secondly, that with declining global FDI flow, mostly dictated by three things. One, I mentioned the relocation of production networks, mostly driven by economic nationalism than anything else. But also we have seen with the rise of the digital economy, many enterprises' investments abroad are capital light. There's a limited footprint of new enterprises in FDI locations abroad. Already the FDI flow to Africa was very, very modest. In the last 4 or 5 years, recovery from the pre-2008 financial crisis was inadequate. We were only in the level of 45 to 50 billion US dollars a year. But what have we seen? We've just seen in the last 6-7 months, a very, very dramatic decline. FDI flow to Africa declined 30% in the second quarter of this year. Similarly, no, in the first half of the year. Similarly, greenfield project announcements, which is always an indicator of future investment direction, has declined by about 65% across Africa. And mergers and acquisitions, cross-border mergers and acquisitions have declined 65%, 45% in the same period. Now, this suggests that investment is taking a sharp break on what we're anticipating going forward in Africa. And this means that foreign investment-driven revenue projections are hitting at the tailspin. And governments have this dual challenge. How do you finance the necessary pandemic responses? How do you cushion enterprise and consumers from the vagaries of rapid contracting economies? You are the authorities know better than me, but our projection is that Kenya's GDP contracted 6% in the second quarter of 2020. This translates into substantial decline in what are the possible sources of revenues. A number of things become very clear that we don't have to enumerate and the challenges that are compounded by the pandemic, but look at what are the levers and what are the best practices for securing reasonable fiscal space in difficult, challenging times. One important area of this for some of us has been a global effort we've been involved in, which is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative of the G20 countries. The origin of that campaign was from the developing world. The G20 was the first international institution that embraced it and brought it in the Bretton Woods Institutions discourse about how can we spread out the comfort of reduced domestic pressure, particularly in countries with high debt. When your debt, public debt reaches 63% of GDP, as it is in Kenya, you are on the borderline of unsustainable by IMF indicators. And therefore, it is necessary that at these difficult times, measures that reduce the pressure from such debt be looked at. That's why some of us were rather surprised when Kenya voluntarily stepped away from the offer of the DSSI, when all the other countries in comparable conditions took it on board. The argument given that it will besmirch your credit rating from the private sector, the jury is still out about how good that argument is. Because the suspension at least reduced pressure of government competing with business in domestic credit markets, which is a major challenge that's going to impact the ability of Kenya to recover better. A number of things are important, I think we have to look at. The first one, there is out there resilience-seeking investment possibilities. There are enterprises which are looking for markets with clear policies and pathways of resilience, and positioning the government as a partner in attracting resilience-seeking investment can stem the decline of FDI that we've noted in some areas. Secondly, as the world goes regional and local, African recovery must also go local and regional, meaning that the drivers of enterprise of the next decade have to be to address challenges in neighborhoods. What is it that has been making Kenya's productive capacity relatively declining compared to its neighbors? When I was Minister of Trade, Kenya was a leading exporter, was a net value-added exporter to Tanzania. In the past few years, Tanzania has become a net value-added exporter to Kenya. Those are challenges that have to be addressed. No country can have a sustainable industrial policy, growth policy, which does not contain a clear pathway to building productive capacity, making made in your country competitive in quality, but also in price. Similarly, this has been a set of factors you cannot be the anchor for greater regional integration. Your initiative to spread hands and embrace Ethiopia confronts three challenges. The first one is what are the lessons learned in the East African community to bring to a more competitive Kenya. The second one is Ethiopia doesn't have a minimum wage. And an EPZ worker in Ethiopia, flour farm worker in Ethiopia earns less than 1/3 of the minimum wage. If we remove tariff borders between Kenya and Ethiopia, it does become rocket science to discover which direction the flow of goods. But I think, be that as it may, Kenya's future lies in addressing its non-competitiveness as a way of turning around the challenges of the region and the opportunities of the region. In the long term, Kenya's industrial resilience is going to depend on African markets. The third direction of looking at how do we anchor our pursuit of fresh revenue sources has been dominating your discussions earlier today. And I don't think I can say too much more. The digital economy. The organization I lead publishes the transformation to electronic policy, legislation and regulatory framework for cross-border digital economy. We had the privilege to be working with the Kenya government on a national digital economy policy. And we have done diagnostic studies for 28 African and LDC countries on the state of play in digitalization. But some things stand out. It's not good enough to say that digitalization is the direction of the future. It is post-digitalization. An overwhelming phenomenon that we measured about the digital economy globally, that 76% of the value of digitalization globally, in the largest, the top 100 multinational enterprises in the digital economy are the US and Chinese. And in terms of created value in the digital space, Europe operates only slightly better than Africa, comparable to South Korea and Russia. What does it mean? If we just emphasize the importance of the digital economy, building the digital infrastructure, and opening up the marketplace for digitalization, two things are happening. First of all, we grow digital consumers much faster than we grow digital producers. Secondly, I started together with Jack Ma, an initiative of growing African digital entrepreneurs through taking some African young men and women to the Alibaba campus in Hangzhou to try to learn build electronic market visibility. And how do we start linking up with the countryside, the which our village was done in China? The first thing that comes clearly to me, the digital platforms that come here to do commerce, they are very excited to help you import goods from abroad. Extremely reluctant to help you export goods. I think state policy is necessary if we do not have digitalization as ease of importation, as ease of building a consumer economy, but we see it as a possibility to build productive capacity, expose electronic marketplace for the produce sector. And this is the World Economic Trade platform that Alibaba build in Rwanda what it has to do. It has to be driven by government. It cannot be left to enterprise. Third, I'm sorry, Madam Moderator, you didn't tell me how much time I have. I'm just going on. Third, and now I don't speak as a United Nations and the Secretary General. I speak as a Kenyan. The future of Kenya lies in understanding and driving enterprise Kenya. A tax administrator can be very efficient in getting rightful taxes from every enterprise. But national policy must drive the development of enterprise to make it easier that tax administrators, tax managers actually get their fair share. We have seen a number of things. When I was minister and chairman, you are head of public service, we reached over 20% credit growth for private sector. In the last few years, because of interest rate cap, inter alia, we went down to 1.9% credit growth for private sector. Things have started improving. Now you're about 7%. But there is a reality that if there is no established policy and practice that drives the growth of competitive priced credit for the private sector, the most noble ideas about being better remain rhetoric. Secondly, the exchange rate between good politics and good economics must be established. Over the last 15 years, this country has acted as if political inclusion is more important than economic inclusion. Many times we make the economy a servant of politics. And we undertake political experiments with massive expansion of political bureaucracies. And we say, if it will bring peace to the country, if it will make people happy, it is a price worth paying. But the people who say that are not paying the price. They are parasites of enterprise, Kenya. At a time when we want to build back better, when our regional competitiveness is uncertain, when you are surrounded by neighbors who sometimes are ready to cut their nose to spite their face, they'll be more interested in hurting Kenya, even if it entails an economic cost. When you're having generations of graduates without a permanent job in a decade, the best politics in the land can be to address how do we build the machine, the enterprise, how do we build the taxpayers of Kenya to provide the resources that will make it comfortable to do the politics we want to experiment with. It can't be another dash with the exchequer for resources to keep the politicians happy. With that conversation is too important to be left exclusively to politicians. Some quick steps can help ameliorate the challenges that we face. This year, my organization published the Economic Development in Africa report on the theme of illicit financial flows out of Africa. On average, Africa is losing close to $90 billion a year through misinvoicing, transfer pricing, and other illicit financial transfers. If we can collectively fight illicit fund transfer of our resources out of the continent, we'll have been able to raise 50% of the gap in financing of SDG agenda for Africa, SDG investment in Africa. Every one of our countries has a responsibility and the possibility to do something about this. Similarly, at a time when governments, including Kenya's government, are negotiating for strengthening market access through free trade agreements with different countries, it's critically important that securing enterprise Kenya must protect, ring-fence and protect manufacturing, ring-fence and protect agriculture. I was in London during the Anglo-Africa Summit in February and listened to Prime Minister Boris Johnson say, we want closer integration with Africa. We want more people in Africa to eat chicken from Dover. And I was thinking that I didn't think that Africa was going in international markets to look for chicken to import. But if you don't deliberately fight against it, you will still be the dumping ground of chicken, not just from Dover, also from the southern states of the US. It's important that the productive sectors are the raison d'etre of any FTA negotiation you have with anybody. I also wanted to mention just one thing, and I'll try to say to this. I live in Geneva, in Switzerland, for the last 7.5 years. One of the things that has been curious to me is many years ago, the Kenyan government wrote to the Swiss government, say we have reason to believe that there's some suspicious money from Anglo leasing, which has been banked in Switzerland, and we would like your assistance not to lose this money. The Swiss government took in the message, investigated, identified Anglo leasing money, and froze those accounts, and wrote to the Kenya government that you have frozen Anglo leasing money and tell us the procedures through which we can help you to repatriate this money. The Kenya government let that trail go cold. As of last week, Switzerland was still waiting for Kenya to ask for the Anglo leasing money that is there. Why are we looking for new money when we're not ready to take in what we already own, which has an address? So a public engagement and commitment to get what belongs to us is the first step towards dealing with very difficult circumstances when the best efforts of intensifying collection cannot be matched with the expansion of the people in the catchment for taxation because of a stalling economy. When the uncertainty of small enterprises have been closed because of COVID, or the services industry globally, 75% of hospitality industry in the world has disappeared in the last 7 months. 80% of international travel has disappeared. Many of the supplier groups, be they traditional dancers, musicians, vegetable producers, they are a statistic which we don't address, will be the grave diggers of our democracy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Daktari, what an interesting conversation that we have had, and some very sobering moments, I think, in terms of that balance between, I was taking down notes, as you were speaking. So some wonderful insights into where we are now, what have been some of the challenges that have beset, our revenue mobilization, and so some interesting things. I like the exchange rate between good politics and economic growth. I think that is key. Just making sure that we enhance our regional competitiveness, particularly now when things are particularly tough. So I'd like to then get into our panel sessions now, and I'll just ask our panelists to come and sit up here with us on the podium. So that we can begin. We will hear some presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Mrs. Suzanne Moduna. She's the member of the board of the Kenya Revenue Authority. She has held various management positions in the local banking industry, a woman who's well known for over 20 years. She's also a fellow of the Institute of Bankers and fellow of the Institute of Management. And she has had extensive positions in various boards, including Safaricom, as well as being the chair of the board of the Kenya Commercial Bank Group. Asante sana, Madam Moduna. We also have Edwin Makori, who's the CEO of the Institute of Certified Public Accountants in Kenya, that is ISPAC. A man known very well in the accounting circles and renowned for pioneering the Financial Reporting Award that recognizes financial reporting excellence in Kenya and indeed in the region. Asante sana bwana CPA Makori, thank you and welcome. Now, like we said, we're having a hybrid session, so we also have our guests who are joining us from around the world as well. I'll also just introduce, she's on your screens right now, or she will be in just a moment, Ms. Jiaming Lee. She's the Center Coordinator of East Africa Regional Technical Assistance Center. She's been a mission chief in the African department of the IMF, and she's led the department's networks on Asia-Africa relations. Also joining us virtually is Marcio Verdi. He's the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Center for Tax Administrations, has had a long-standing career in the Brazilian government and was appointed to his current role in January of 2010. Finally, as well, talking about the balance between protecting health and also ensuring that we have thriving economies. We have Peter Hurst, who's a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, previously worked for the Department for International Development and the UK Treasury. They will be joining us for this discussion, and each of them will have presentations to make and opening remarks. And I'd like to start off first with the virtual presentation from you, Mr. Marcio Verdi. Thank you very much. A warm round of applause to you as you make your presentation. Mr. Verdi, if you can hear me, are you on mute? Could you unmute? There we go.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, sir. Carry on.
Okay, sorry. So first of all, I would like to thank the Kenya Revenue Agents for the invitation. Actually, it's an honor for me to participate in this important tax summit, especially for the topic, innovative approach to sustain economies in the COVID crisis. And balancing revenue needs is such a challenge, no? And I have prepared a summary of the main measures that countries, the tax administration, have been implemented to face the crisis. And I have only another chart to show the impact of the crisis in the level of tax collection. And to conclude, and maybe will be the most interesting part of my presentation, I'd like to discuss some tax policy options that I understand that we should study to overcome this enormous fiscal need that we are facing in our economies. No? My first slide, I'm sorry, could you move next one, please? Yes, okay, so sorry, because I was trying to move here from myself. My second slide is a resume of what the tax administration have done. So we can, so what kind of measures we have implemented. No? I think if we squeeze these measures looking for the word, no, we can say that we gave to the taxpayers additional time for dealing with tax affairs, no? Especially with the extensions of deadlines, deferral of payments, reminding penalties and interest, debt payments plans, suspending debt recovery. So this kind of measure, if we have discussed this measure in last December in a tax summit, people say, well, this is impossible. We cannot support such level of measures. We can't not implement this because these measures is a synonym of a price in terms of tax collection and in terms of the daily activities of our tax administration. But we have to decide, no? And of course, the right decision was to give measures to collaborate with the taxpayers, with the economy, to face this crisis. No? And we implement other measures like to quicker refunds to taxpayers. And we decided to change, at least temporarily, our audit policy and create new ways to provide quicker tax certainty. Huh? And we had to enhance taxpayer service and communication initiative. And this is easy to say, but it was enormous challenges. I don't like to measure countries. So in this case, I will talk about my country. If you look for the Brazilian tax administration, only for the federal tax administration, there are states tax administration, local, The federal, they have 25,000 employees. It's a big country. Normally, they used to have like 400, 500 working from home. In 1 month, they had to create the conditions to have more than 20,000 employees working from home. So it wasn't easy. It was a such challenge for the tax administration, especially when we had to implement many new measures, as I just mentioned. No? So, but when we look for these measures, immediately comes many questions to discuss, like, for example, for how long should we keep these measures? What will be the duration of the measures? No? And of course, when you create measures, you should adopt only for with a target approach, only for those taxpayers that are most affected, or to all taxpayers. I would say that only to those most affected, but in many cases, we cannot do this. So in many cases, we gave to a group of taxpayers that actually they didn't need as other groups, no? But what is more complicated is for how long, no? So it's now we are living a situation that we need to evaluate the measures and try to concentrate the measures that we have taken in when it is absolutely necessary, because there is no free lunch. It's a high cost to implement this measure. Especially, I'd like to go straight to this chart. Could you please change for the chart that I have in terms of the collection? Could you move to the next? You can skip the others. Go to the chart, please. Could you move the chart, please? Another one, just move to next one. Next one, please. I'd like to see the chart of the impact of the tax collection. Is the next one. Next one. Okay, this one. This is the impact on tax revenue since March. No? When we see this, it's easy to conclude that the crisis, of course, the crisis affects our lives, our world, our society, but it hits the tax administration very strongly. No? If you look for the zero line, no, is the average of the last year. No? This is data that we pick up from the public data from more than 30 countries of the world. You can see this study in our website. I selected just one chart. There are many, more than 50 different charts, country by countries, but this one is enough to see that in total, from consider January, we lost 22.4% of the level of tax collection. This is too much, because we know that it's not easy when we need to increase 1 or 2 or 3% of the level of the tax collection for any country. If we have a measure, a goal to increase 3% in a year, we know that this is not easy. And we lost 22.4. I have data until last month, September, October, and thanks God, things become, we can see that we are starting to recuperate. But no doubt that we will have a long road and a difficult path to return to the same average that we had last year. And this is in a moment that we had to increase the level of expenditures. So this situation, the reduction of the tax burden and the increase in the level of expenditure create a difficult equation for our countries. No? And there are two big risks here. First, especially for developing countries, is if the countries start using inflation to increase the level of collection. Because of course, if we have an inflation, it affects positively the level of collection. So I can reduce the deficit using inflation. I call this the tax inflation. Maybe the worst is the second worst tax in the world. The first worst tax is the tax evasion, is the evasion that you pay and I don't. Of course, you cannot compete with me if you pay your tax and if I don't. But the second one is the inflation, the use of inflation to reduce the deficit. And the other risk is to increase the debt level of the countries. This could be done, but there is a limit, because we should remember that public debt, is a tax that my grandson or my son will have to pay in the future. So we need to have clear in our mind that there is only one way to solve this equation. Is trying to recuperate the level of taxation that we had before the crisis. And to do this, could you please move to the next slide? I have selected just, actually it's very difficult to forecast any situation because we don't have a clear picture about the pandemic's evolution, the economic dynamics. So it's difficult to define what kind of tax measure we should implement. But I have selected a few measures, group of measures that I think we should evaluate. Could you please change to the next one? And this slide is a resume of what I think we should discuss. This is what I call orthodox measures, orthodox economic, or maybe better than economic tax measures. First one is try to broadening tax base. This is easy to say, difficult to implement, but maybe we should evaluate mechanisms to reduce the informality in our societies. Maybe we need to review thresholds on our tax base. And what is very important is the second one, try to collaborate with the private sector, trying to have a friendly taxation. What I mean friendly taxation for me is to implement measures to collaborate in order to improve the productivity of the companies, the modernization, the use of IT, to reduce measures that could reduce the tax transaction cost of taxation, like the implementation of electronic invoice, like to offer to the taxpayers draft tax return. There are many measures that we can use, like the use of artificial intelligence, that could reduce the tax transaction cost and evaluate other tax base, like property tax. We know that we collect less than a half of developed country, of the amount of the developed countries collect. But maybe what is more important when we look for orthodox measures is to reduce the tax fraud. Because as I said, if there is a bad tax, is the tax evasion. Is the tax that you pay and I don't. So we need to strengthen the tax administration, work with them, improve the collaboration among vertical and horizontal, among different tax countries and international organizations in order to improve the tax administration to fight against the tax fraud. But there are many non-orthodox measures that we are discussing in many developing countries. Like, for example, there are many, but I have selected, in this case, just 5. Minimum taxation rules. What this exactly means? As we know, there are many companies, they work 5 years, 10 years, even more, and they never have a profit. Is it possible to a company exist and during more than 10 years only with losses? So in many countries, we are discussing to implement a minimum level of taxation, considering the level of equity or other values. Financial transactions tax, they exist in many countries. Is it a good tax? A tax on debt on your current account or credit? Of course it's not, because it's a cascading tax, but it's very difficult to evade. So maybe we can compensate this with your income tax. You pay and you can compensate, but we can guarantee an amount of tax from those groups that they don't pay tax. In export duties, I don't like export duties, but in many cases, with the valuation of the currencies and with the price of a few commodities, maybe, and it exists in a few countries, we can evaluate the possibility to create a temporary tax on exports just in this case. It's the same for windfall tax. When you have an extraordinary profit, and is a tax. But I would like to go, I know that I need to conclude. What we can say that are the trends. Green taxation is another good possibility, but to discuss green taxation, we need this in an international forum, because it's very difficult for a developing countries to put a tax on the carbon, for example. We need to do this in an international base. And it's very important to discuss how to put a price on carbon emission. I'm not saying to increase the price of oil or food, combustible. No, it's to the carbon emission. And the digital taxation. Well, as we all know here, we are discussing in the international forum, especially at the OECD, measures on a United Nations is discussing this and have a very interesting proposal, how we could tax the income of the digital activities. But we don't have to wait for any international road to implement taxation on the consumption of the digital economy. And this is very important because it's important to the companies that are selling, offering, supplying service to in Kenya, for example. To create an equity condition, we can levy this same consumption tax to the international companies, to those companies that they don't have a permanent established. We don't need to have any international rules to implement tax on the consumption of digital products. And if you look for Argentina, Colombia, Uruguay, they are collecting consumption tax on the digital economy if you don't have a permanent establishment. Another important tax to discuss is the wealth taxation. I'm not saying that we should tax the wealthiest. No, it's not this. But to evaluate the progressive of the tax system, no? And what we need to have clear is that there is no free lunch. So many policies that in this case, I use a expression, helicopter money. It was very important what the governments have done to give financial support to our population. Maybe this was what allows our citizens to survive during this terrible crisis. But for how long? So it's the same if we cannot stimulus generate measures to stimulate the debt. What we need to have is trying to implement measures to reduce the tax collection cost. The tax transaction cost is more complex, and evaluate new possibilities. And to conclude, I would say that maybe for developing countries, we can use this opportunity as the developed countries are discussing the nexus and justifying that we should collect tax on income base, even if you don't have a permanent established, and I applaud this initiative, but maybe we can use this opportunity to discuss in a world base the importance to tax at the source for all service. So not only for digital service, any service done in a developing country for a company without a permanent establishment should pay tax, in my opinion. So I thank you very much for this opportunity. I would love if I have an opportunity to discuss these questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcio Verdi, and some interesting issues that you raised. We'll come back to that, some of the lessons that the developing world can sort of learn and maybe pick up as we go. Next, Ms. Suzanne Moduna, Member, Board of Directors, the Kenya Revenue Authority. Your chance to make your remarks, and then we'll get into some questions a little later.
Thank you very much. I want to say that it's a great opportunity for me to be here, and I'm going to talk briefly about some of the efforts that KRA has taken or is taking to protect taxpayers' businesses and to foster the economic stability, so that we can be in a position to collect the revenue and meet the expectations that the Kenya government has put in place. I was impressed to hear the first speaker talk about the fact that we should start by preserving what we have and make sure that that is protected and before we look outside. And for that reason, I'm going to talk briefly about what we are doing at KRA in regard to that, what measures we are taking to make sure that there's business continuity and for our taxpayers, and that there are some measures that also will mitigate against the effects of COVID-19. As everybody knows, this pandemic has affected every economy. It's not only here in developing world, but also in the first world, and therefore it's a common enemy. And whatever we do, we believe that. We believe that it will yield results that is not just to protect the economy today, but also tomorrow. At KRA, the approach we have made, and first of all, is try to understand the risks that the businesses are going through, so that even as we approach them for revenue collection, there's some collaboration, especially for those taxpayers that are regular, that we've been relying on for their revenue, and as an organization, as was said in the morning, we are trying to be more service-oriented, that we understand the problem of our taxpayers, and if there's any need for us to reschedule the payments, then we can have discussions with them and see how that can be arranged. And for those who have special problems, that we do listen, and where there's a way of assisting, we do. If there are even issues to do with policy matters, we have a very good relationship with the National Treasury, and some of these issues are taken forward to them. But that is not to say that for the hardcores who are not willing to pay taxes, we let them go. We still have the law on our side, and those people who think that they should not pay tax and yet enjoy the services that the government is providing, we have means and the power to deal with those. But that is not where we want to concentrate. We want to concentrate on areas where we are going to yield some revenue. So what we have done also is to try to speed up, payment for refunds for the various taxes, the taxes for the refunds that are due and verified to taxpayers, so that they can have float to carry on with their businesses, and this also works as an incentive to them. I know we talked a lot in the morning about technology, but innovation is not just technology. Innovation is also the way you process your reorganize or re-engineer your processes and operations. So we do try to see that whatever services that we give to the taxpayers is relevant for the time and is convenient, and therefore there's a lot of communication that we have between us and the taxpayers, and education, and so that they understand how we work. Forums like this gives the opportunity for us to interact with taxpayers and other stakeholders, so that there's an understanding between us, and we know that we know what their expectations are. I would also like to mention that as we collaborate with the taxpayers and encourage them to pay their taxes, the authority has also implemented alternative dispute resolution system. This has worked well for us. In the last about 2 years, we have seen growth in this area, so that tax disputes that were stuck in courts are now coming back to ADR, and which is a good thing, because it takes a shorter time, and there's some level of understanding between the parties, and we have been able to recover quite a substantial amount of money through that. And this is just demonstrates the fact that we are changing the approach that we have towards our taxpayers, and we want to see some level of understanding rather than having disputes that last so long in the courts. I would also like to mention the fact that we are rolling out some systems and platforms which were talked about in the morning. We talked about the M-Service, but the iTax, of course, is now a household name almost. I would also just want to touch on the customs and the customs administration and say that we are also, there's also a platform that is being rolled out by next year that will make it easier for documentation to be processed. And this is important because as a result of this, there'll be less human intervention. And this is where the problems has been in the past, that the delays, and apart from delays, there have been issues of integrity, and it's not just a problem with the authority, but it's a problem in the society, that where two people are handling documents. At times when there's some urgency, there's a temptation for compromising the operations. So as we do this, we hope that there'll be much more, use of automation, so that we have efficient processes, and also we have processes that are transparent for the benefit of everybody. I want also to bring to your attention that we do use third-party information through our intelligence department to get, sometimes we have to use it where we either there's some difficulty from taxpayers, and they don't submit the right information that is required. And this has also helped in, especially now during this time with the pandemic. There are some taxpayers that maybe use the excuse that because we are going through this difficult, challenging times, that they should not play their part by submitting their or filing the right documents with the authority. So I would like to urge, our taxpayers that maybe this is not an area that we want to be, that we expect everybody to cooperate. But if they don't, then we would use this alternative. And I think that some might look at it as a positive step, because it brings it brings that sense of feeling that when we do this, then we are not leaving anybody out as far as tax payment is concerned. That would use every possible means to bring in the tax bracket. In relation to this, I would also like to mention that we now have a whistleblowing also system, and this gives the public the opportunity to give us any information that they may have that might help us to reach out to those areas or to those people who do not want to pay tax, either deliberately, or it could be they have special difficulties that we may want to know and address. So I would also want to emphasize the fact that as we go forward, we want to collaborate with everybody, and we also want to simplify the way we collect taxes, so that everybody who is in the tax bracket should be able to do it without any hindrance. And that is why we coming up with a lot of platforms that is going to help us do that. Look, going forward, I think what I can say is that we will continue to have regular consultations with our taxpayers, with all stakeholders, and also we also want to we also want to make sure that we have an open door policy, and this is what the current board is trying to really to encourage, that if you have ideas that you can bring that to us that can help us enhance tax collection, that you will be welcomed. If you have problems that you think are not being solved at maybe your station, wherever you are based, you can always come up to the next level if you think that it will be solved there. And therefore, I think even as we go through difficult time, CARE is making all efforts to do this, and also to look at other areas, other non-traditional areas where we can tap, revenue, and this will is an effort that is going to continue as we go forward, because we have targets to meet, and as with these constraints, we cannot be going back to the same the same taxpayers, and there's every year after year we need to expand that base, and so we are looking at other areas where we can bring in more revenue.
Right.
So I think that's what I would like to comment on for the time being.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we will definitely get into that a little bit more. I just want to remind our audiences who are watching and following us via Zoom, we're seeing many of you raising your hands. Please just put your question in there in the chat option, and we will get to your questions. I've already seen some of them, so thank you very much for that. I'm already seeing questions to Dr. Kitui, and Mr. Marcy already. So some good interaction that we have. So instead of raising your hand, just drop your comment in there. We'll definitely make sure we address them as much as we can. Also, while you're on that platform, and also on Twitter, the Twitter handle is @KRA Corporate. The hashtag is Tax Summit 2020. We're asking you this question. Have tax policy measures implemented been effective in mitigating the COVID-19 socio-economic effects? I'll take that again. Have the tax policy measures that have been implemented been effective in mitigating the socio-economic effects of COVID-19? Let us know. The hashtag is Tax Summit 2020. Also on the Zoom chat, let us know what your thoughts are and perhaps some suggestions on what more can be done. I remember Mercy already saying you put in place some options, but then do they have a time frame? How do you make sure you mitigate that? I would like to have a presentation from our next speaker, Ms. Lee from the Center. She's the Center Coordinator of East African Regional Technical Assistance Center. Madam, thank you for making the time for us here today. And we'd like to just remind you I understand you've got a presentation of 7 minutes. Just a reminder to get to that because we've got lots of questions coming in and everybody would like a moment for their input to be had as well. Ms. Lee?
Thank you very much. This is a real pleasure and honor to participating in this event. Tax policy and administration is such an important topic worldwide, and particularly during this pandemic period. As we heard from previous speakers, the pandemic had affected all the authorities around the world, and be able to collect taxes past the pandemic will be essential for the countries to continue to be able to provide essential public services and social support. So today I'm just going to highlighting some of the work that's been done by the IMF. Because of the time constraints, I'll be focusing on a few things that we have worked on. So the next page. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the question I'm addressing today is about the revenue collection during COVID-19 and support post-COVID recovery. Next. here is a pointer to a large number of work that had been done by the IMF. On the overview side, the IMF has an IMF and a COVID-19 website, so many documents are there. And specifically for Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a regional economic outlook. The most recent one was issued in October. And beyond that, in the fiscal areas, we have a large number of special issues notes and address various issues. Today, I'm going to highlight in 3 types of notes that have been produced by the IMF. The first one is on the tax issues and an overview. So here, the notes, the main thing focus is that to make sure that the measures can act fast and move the tax system in desirable directions. First is on the health-focused measures. So this would be important to promote the contactless processes and procedures to reduce the infections and promote collections. And the second part is on the business survivals. So how the collections and sometimes also adjustment of policies to help businesses to survive, because these are important for the economy to recover in the future. And then direct protections. These are including the targeted tax reductions and also various measures, for example, including payroll, social security tax reductions for low-paid segment of business or economy. And then the fourth area is securing revenue and promoting solidarities. Example will be including solidarity charges. For example, in one of the countries I worked on, the country actually introduced the solidarity surcharges on a segment of the employment which are less affected by the pandemic. And also strengthen the crisis management. That's very, very important. The second note that I like to highlight is on tax administration responses. Protecting staff and taxpayers from COVID-19 is a priority, as noted previously, and it is essential to balance temporary relief policies with protecting revenue and safeguarding compliance. So in this area, it's very important to consider the business continuities, how to make sure the tax administration continue to function. And this is in this area, there are 3 sub-components. It is essential to have a senior crisis management, the team to managing and response to the situation, and to planning to implement priority actions. So this is including issuance of refunds, delivery of social benefit checks, and trade facilitations. So many of these issues have been addressed by previous speakers. And also on the HR side, managing the workforce to prepare to work with a reduced workforce or alternative arrangement. We heard from Mr. Verdi in Brazil. There's a large segment of the employees have to work remotely. And the second topic is on easing taxpayer obligations. So this would including to extend the tax refund deadlines. However, the measures need to focus on reducing compliance costs for the small business. However, at the same time to ensure large taxpayer compliance. And it also including measures to allow provisional tax payments to reflect the lower income. The third area is implementing government support policies, quickly implementing public policies of the measures for the coping with the pandemic are important to achieve intended policy effect. The fourth area is on communication, both internally, so the workforce knows what to do, and at the same time to be clear with the public, particularly taxpayers. So this, I also heard a lot of emphasis previously by the speakers. And protecting revenue and safeguarding compliance. I also heard previous speaker noted that we need to make sure that these measures are temporary, so they won't erode long-term compliance. Next. Next slide, please. So the last issues I like to highlight on is the reinvigorating operations. Obviously, given the COVID-19, we don't have a clear demarcation of when the post-COVID-19 will start. So they continue to ensure safety and health of staff and taxpayers will be a priority. And at the same time, it is essential to prepare to restore operations and safeguard tax collections and compliance to the pre-COVID crisis levels. So here I'd like to highlight 3 key lessons around the world. First is on business continuities. Countries that have a business continuity plans have fared better than those who does not have one. So it is important to have a plan to plan for disruptive event to ensure continuity. So in this areas, the key components of business continuity would include governance, emergency management team, human resources. How do you plan to manage the human employment to make sure the workforce is effective? And what are the essential services that you need to prioritize, and other important services? The IT support, how you're going to operate them during the crisis, as well as how you communicate during the crisis. The second lesson is digitalize the revenue administrations and the taxpayer compliance has worked better. So which we also heard that from previous speakers. This would help the administrations to both managing internal process and also compliance. The third lessons I like to highlight is risk-based compliance management is very important. This would help the administrations to direct resources to critical areas that's essential, particularly during the crisis when the resources is severely constrained. Good risk management can also help better understand the taxpayer compliance issues and to help to develop mitigation actions. So these are the key comments that I have, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, for that. And, you know, starting to look forward and just talking about having the systems, you know, in place as we move forward, as we start to think about how we're building resilience and even to, you know, prepare for an eventuality like this. Hopefully we never have to go through it. But if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's about thinking ahead and Peter, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can. Sorry, I think you were on mute there for the last minute or so, but I can
All
hear
right.
you.
Okay. So welcome. Thank you for your time. Just talk to us about some of the ways in which we can harness technology for revenue collection at this point, and more importantly, the role of non-state actors, during this time of revenue mobilization.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Hurst. I'm from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's great to be here with you today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. So those are the two things that I'm going to give my perspective on. So I'll talk first on innovative approaches and harnessing technology to sustain revenue collection. And I'm going to focus on digital financial services here because this is an issue of interest to us at the foundation and to some of our partners. As I'm sure you're aware, a lot of economies right now are transitioning from being cash-based to becoming increasingly more digital, with countries such as Sweden and Rwanda planning on becoming cashless societies in the medium term. So you may ask, why is that important for tax reform? Well, the assumption, and it remains untested, is there's an expectation that the move into digital payments can actually yield quite a significant increase in tax revenues, potentially through increased VAT collection and better enforcement of tax compliance as companies, merchants, and consumers come out of the informal economy and into the formal sector. So one example of how this has happened is in South Korea. So what they've done there over the past few years is they've incentivized consumers into making payments digitally by giving them tax rebates. So the initiative was very simple. What they did was, when taxpayers filed their year-end income tax returns, they could claim tax reductions for eligible purchases made using electronically traceable payments. So it would basically incentivize them to come into the digital space. And what that did was it dramatically improved reporting of merchant payment transactions. So, I mean, firstly, it incentivized the move towards a cashless society, but it also led to a net gain in revenues of $1.3 billion and a large increase in personal income tax revenues. So, I mean, that South Korea example can be seen as the goal of what could be achieved, but given the digital infrastructure that's being built in Africa at the moment, there's plenty of reasons why that can be replicated in Africa, especially in Kenya, where you have M-Pesa, in Rwanda as well. And let's not forget that during the COVID pandemic, many countries have actually encouraged a shift from cash payments onto digital payments, and in order to reduce the need for in-person contact. So digital payments are going up. So it's actually an opportunity which has been generated by COVID. But however, successful efforts to use digitalization to strengthen domestic resource mobilization, I mean, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. It's something that requires a holistic, coordinated approach across both the public sector and the private sector as well. I'm going to quote a study by Better Than Cash Alliance because they looked into Tanzania's digital payment initiatives and found that it had generated at least $477 million annually for a variety of ways, ranging from a 42% increase in the collection of vehicle taxes and a 40% boost in VAT collection from small businesses, which are obviously very significant revenues. So I think it's certainly worth looking into. And I guess revenue authorities, they can take advantage of increased digital payments in two ways. Firstly, by a direct widening of the tax base through direct and indirect taxes, as I've been talking about. But secondly, by indirectly generating payment data and audit trails. So basically, digital payments, it brings, it allows you to look at tax data from banks, etc., and then you can track compliance and increase and facilitate tax compliance in that way. So I mean, admittedly, a lot of the ways that you need to do this, what you have to do is address cross-cutting structural barriers that are mostly out of scope of tax administrations. However, there are a few impactful revenue mobilization approaches that revenue authorities can take to incentivize electronic payments. I mean, for example, governments can use subsidies and other tax inducements to encourage businesses and consumers to adopt digital financial services. So fiscal incentives to merchants and subsidies to retailers to install electronic point of sale terminals. Or you could do lotteries for consumers and merchants that act as fiscal incentives. You could also disincentivize the use of cash transactions to introduce a less favorable tax treatment for cash merchant payments. So for example, disallow deduction of business expenses from taxable income if the expenses are paid in cash. And then also on the VAT side, you could deny a deduction of input VAT for inputs that are paid in tax. And then also, as I was talking about just before, you can take advantage of digitalization by improving voluntary compliance through, for example, by going digital, you'll then have access to broader access to financial data, bank account information, data on credit and debit card transaction volumes, and that can provide important information on deposit and disbursement of undeclared incomes. So, I mean, these are all kind of excellent ways to boost move to digital, and then also at the same time increase revenue. So certainly an innovative approach. I mean, this is quite a nascent field. At the Gates Foundation, we've actually funded a program to look further into this, the Digitax program, which is run by the International Center for Tax and Development. And that's looking into what was doing research into this area, as well as some capacity building. And I'd just say, if you're interested in engaging in this program, then please do get in touch with us. So the other area that I'm going to talk about today is tax and civil society. It's also another important area, and one that I often find is much neglected in the tax field. I mean, as everyone knows, tax reform is inherently political enterprise. I mean, that's true whether you live in a developed country such as the UK, where I'm based, or if you're in Africa. And that political dynamic is going to be especially true in the next few years, with countries facing very large fiscal deficits and debt payments as a result of COVID. And countries are going to have to answer that question. So countries as a society are going to have to answer that question. Who's going to bear the burden of closing that fiscal gap? And how are you going to finance future development and spending on important issues such as healthcare, education, social protection? Yeah, I mean, tax reforms, they're often controversial because, you know, we're talking about important issues here, how governments are funded and resources are distributed. But I mean, I think what governments need to do is they need to engage in that social bargaining process between the government, businesses, civil society, and look at those engaged in tax reform debates as a cohesive whole rather than as necessarily competing groups. Yeah, it's vital for governments to engage in that process for the reforms to be successful. And I feel that traditionally revenue authorities, and totally understandably, they focus their tax compliance strategies on increasing enforcement activities, so increasing fines for non-compliance, and also facilitation as well. So to make, you know, they've tried to make paying taxes a lot easier to ensure that taxpayers comply. But I feel that the missing component there is trust. So if you can build trust with your between the revenue authority or between the government and the taxpayers, then that can have a big impact on tax compliance, because taxpayers will voluntarily pay their taxes, and they'll do so because they share the values of the government, share social norms, they have trust and fairness in the government, and a sense of equity, reciprocity, etc. And they feel that paying their taxes is in the public interest. I know it's very easy to say that, of course, but certainly a goal to be able to aim for.
All right, Peter, I just want you to hold that thought, because you've raised an important issue. We'll come back to you, where you're talking about not just enforcement, but building trust that ensures compliance and that makes it easier. Just hold on to that thought for a moment. We've got some great questions that are coming in from our audience who are joining us virtually as well. Again, we remind you, instead of putting your hand up, please just put your question down in the chat. I have a few of those as well. Remember, we're also running a poll where we're talking about the tax policy measures that have been implemented so far. Do you think they have been effective in mitigating the socio-economic effects of COVID-19? And Peter has just been talking about the great relationship between non-state actors and the regulation and the revenue authorities, just in terms of ensuring tax compliance. And this is all about being innovative. So we've already got some great questions. Thank you. I am seeing your questions talking about whether the rich nations are putting forward policy measures. Also questions to Marcio Vedi about some of the things he talked about, like export taxes, and whether that is a challenge to already existing trade obligations with other nations. We'll get to those questions, so keep them coming. There's definitely more. I'm seeing your questions. I will get to them. And we'll also come back to our panelists once more to answer all of these questions. Buona CEO, Edwin, what are the policy and administrative measures that ISPAC is putting forward or proposing, to boost revenue mobilization at this time?
Thank you. First is just to the board of Kerry and the Commissioner General, the management of Kerry, just to be able to appreciate. Can you hear me?
Just hang on, it's a bit, can you get us a mic? Yes, let's just get you another mic in case that one's a little faulty. Could you just, thanks. And we're getting a number of questions. So Edwin, you will have to keep it brief. Excuse me, it's up here on the stage. Thank you.
Maybe just, as I was saying, is just to be able to appreciate, to be given this opportunity, and through the board of Kerry and the Commissioner General and management of Kerry. I think as I sat here and listened through, most of the tax policy measures have actually been alluded to. But looking at it, and when everyone is looking at this particular pandemic, there's this notion to look at the negative side of the pandemic. People have lost jobs, people are working from home. Some organizations have basically closed down. We've had an increased upsurge in the use of technology over the last seven or so months. But in every adversity, there's always an opportunity. And I'm looking at it in terms of, and this from research and survey that has been done globally and is available, that 50% of those that have closed down, 65% of those will reemerge and get into new business. So there's still hope. From the Kenyan perspective, we look at the tax base of 4 million Kenyans or so. Yet we know that that can be expanded to 12, 13 million to be able to provide the much needed taxes. How do we tap into that? In looking at it, and I break it down, let's ask, as much as you say that the pandemic has had effects, if we look at the number of borrowings that went through M-Pesa, 184 billion, that was in 2 months. Where did that money go? It didn't buy plots, it didn't buy cars, it didn't buy infrastructure for that matter. It all went to consumption within that period. So how do we tap into that? And I know there was a discussion this morning about digital transformation and being able to look at this. Going away from that, we have those who have lost jobs, but they form companies. They're actually doing business right now. They must be selling out vegetables. They're buying and selling in some sort of transaction. All that has not been netted in to be tapped in to be able to identify what is that source. And there's an estimation that around 20 or 40 billion of this on a monthly basis is through that consumption. We are looking at it going into the future, and this just being able to open ourselves and being able to say things are going to change. Persons or individuals will be in two perils going forward. Because if I'm working from home, I can actually comfortably work 3 or 4 jobs at the same time. Is it time that we open up this policy and see that this person can actually have 2 8-hour jobs at the same time and being able to finance that through, I know any other income that you have goes through, as per the income tax act, goes at 30%. But realize that people now are going to work in more than one job at a given time. So we just need to be able to be cognizant that that is going to happen. And those jobs may not be local jobs. And those guys will be able to work locally here to a local company and another company abroad. So we need to be able to bring in those and take care of that in terms of the tax measures that we are going to put in place. We've had a lot of data that is going to be generated, and I'm looking at this from supermarkets, M-Pesa itself, Global, the company that is now supplying food into most of the homes, or supplying food into most of the homes. Is it time that from a tax administration perspective that we put in a complete robust unit that analyzes consumer behavior? And you are able to tell, and patterns, as I say, research done by Harvard University, that you can actually predict 89% of consumer behavior in any particular jurisdiction. With that then form a basis of being able to determine with certainty the amount of tax that one is able to get from the potential taxpayers. A number of measures that have been put in place in being able to have a very easy, flexible tax policy that everyone is able to understand, that I'm able to plug in and be able to pay taxes. We'll have to do that, and going forward, getting this into an application where I need to be able to feed in information as fast as possible and submit it to KRA. We were just having a discussion this morning and with some of my colleagues in the office and saying KRA should actually match up what M-Pesa is doing. And I'm just talking about the digital transformation. M-Pesa is integrated to all businesses, and they have the API integration. You can actually pay for your products at any given time. Is it time that we also, as the tax administrator, develop an API integration that gets into the point of sale points of any of the organizations, so that immediately you pay taxes, that is automatically generated to be able to reflect in all of our tax systems and being able to analyze this on a daily basis. I mean, data analytics is going to be one of those, and there's data all over, to be able to determine potential taxpayers who are getting in, because now companies are going to be formed off, because we don't need brick and mortar to form the company. I can form a company, have all my employees work from home, and still be making money. So how do we then get hold of this in form of being able to get data that then drives how we look at tax collection and revenue collection in the future? I won't dwell on the much of the other issues that have been brought in terms of being able to look at tax incentives that are going to be able to spur the economy. But what comes into my mind, and I'll just allude to, is it time that we have structured subsidies, in the sense that, and Mukisa alluded to this, we have to promote Buy Kenya, Build Kenya. And for us to be able to do this, as we get the FDIs, can we be able to say that, yes, we are giving you these subsidies and tax incentives, but 80% of the products that you're going to consume are Kenya products. 50% of the employees that are going to be employed in this particular organization are Kenyan, as you said, the protection policy that we need to be able to put in place. But rather than being too protective, it's just being able to have a balance that is structured in a way that then we bring in foreign direct investment, but also being able to create employment and also spur the economy.
Absolutely. And, ensuring skills transfer as well, that would be important, so that, that is also localized here. Those are some great ones. We have some questions. I'd like us to go to the first slide now and start with the very first question that was posed to Dr. Kitui about whether rich nations are willing to put forward policy measures against transfer pricing, for example, given that the outflows from Africa as beneficiaries of such illegal money. Dr. Kitui?
Thank you. There are a number of different components to illicit financial flows. The most crude form is a partnership between persons in government in the source country with the multinational enterprises involved in the project. So that's just an outright form of partnership in corruption. One of the ways to deal with this has been clearly, like in Africa, embracing and actually utilizing the extractives observatory, which has been developed and embraced by the African Union Commission. It goes a long way in creating transparency in extractives industry, which is one of the main areas for illicit financial flows. Second, many countries do not have the infrastructure, the instruments of law to monitor what is going out, even just to audit the value of what is being taken out. I attended a meeting with an African Minister of Minerals, whom we asked, how do they quantify the mineral that's extracted by a Chinese company for purposes of the resource rents, and said they're dependent on the goodwill of the mining company. Every month they tell them, we have taken out so much, so what is your fair share is so much. They have not even attempted to build a capacity to assess how much is going in. Now, having said that, in many source countries of multinational enterprises, there are growing strict regulations on illicit activity. And that's why you find that most illicit transfers are done through offshore registered offices. And one of the reasons for this is that one of the things we can do is to enjoin the international community in the campaign to close down offshore holding offices for multinationals which belong to other countries. I mean, if you're registered in England, there's no reason why you should register a company in the Bahamas before starting a business in DRC Congo, for example. But finally, also that since global campaign has demonstrated its ability to discipline social responsibility, to discipline abusive, environmentally unsustainable, extractive or production processes, a similar campaign can enforce more acceptable conduct by multinationals particularly.
You're confident that the rich nations will do their part, or are already doing it? What more can be done, do you think?
Not for altruistic reasons.
Yeah,
many times
certainly.
they want to do something because they want to close down possible routes of financing for drugs, money laundering, terrorism financing. So they build infrastructure to monitor illegal movement of money.
Okay.
And on the tail of that, on the back of that, they can also add this as a function.
Okay. Well, I guess it works. I guess it sort of kills two birds with one stone. But perhaps not altruistic, but it's something that we definitely hope we can continue to build. There's another question here for Marcio Verdi and from his presentation. And the question was regarding that presentation. Marcio, I hope you can hear us and hear this question. A few have posited that exit taxes essentially decrease the mobility of capital and labor if applied to certain income taxes. The question goes on to say that indeed countries need to take a sort of defensive stand, particularly when it comes to types of investments that Marcio, you mentioned. But then you talk about the risk that it could be challenged either as a trade barrier or even as violating the transfer of funds provision under a bilateral investment treaty. So what you're really asking, Marcio, today is the increasing risk of certain defensive tax measures, whether they could be challenged in other dispute bodies like trade and investment. Marcio, I hope you got that. Could you please respond to that very briefly?
Thank you very much. Thanks for this very important question. But I'm not referring to measures that affect trade. When I talk about exit taxes, I'm looking for speculative financial flows. I'm referring, for example, to the taxation of funds that comes to a country for the stock market or to invest in a treasury notes or in a bank deposit. And normally in many developing countries, if you live in this country, if you are a resident and you apply money in a stock market, you pay capital gains tax. If you invest, if you buy a treasury note, if you have a capital gains, you should pay tax. And it's the same for any deposit that you receive interest. But in many developing countries, if the funds come from abroad, they don't have to pay tax when they leave the countries. And I understand this, but the problem when the crisis comes, these funds migrate immediately, get back to developed countries. So I am discussing the possibility just to levy the capital from abroad in the same conditions that we pay in our countries. So in this kind of tax, I'm sure that we will not have a problem in terms of World Trade Organization, because it's a tax on speculative capital leaves. So, and it's more, when we don't tax these capitals in our countries, actually, we are giving tax base to developed countries. That's so simple. And why we implemented this advantage for capital from abroad? In order to attract capital. And I support the idea when we are looking for investments on productive units, but not in this speculative flow of money. So that's my idea, to evaluate if this is a possibility to tax the speculative flow of money. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Here's another question. COVID-19 has impacted the operations of the SME sector and enterprises in that microsector. Do you think that the palliative measures in terms of tax relief and others are enough? And this is also tied to that poll that we had set out. I will give you the results of that poll, what some of you think about the measures that have been put in place so far and whether they're offering relief, but particularly for SMEs. Dr. Kitui, and then we can come to the rest of the panel. Do you think these have been helpful for the SME sector?
You know, in many countries where there is capacity and significant resourcing, the stimuli packages have had impact on livelihoods. Many persons who have disrupted incomes have used this like an income insurance, able to service mortgages, able to keep food on the table. It makes a difference. If where you don't have such, you are seeing that instead of a small business slowly declining, say a very abrupt disappearance, the atrophy level in countries without the ability to use that palliative is very, very clear compared to others. I mean, I live in Geneva, and I know people run small restaurants, for example, and the state just projects how much have you been making. And you close the restaurant, but the government gives you a percentage of that to keep your staff having a salary and to stop you from closing the place until the next time you can reopen it. It makes sense, but the challenge you have in territories like developing countries like Kenya is the limited fiscal capacity of the state to give such palliative for most of the impacted, particularly small and medium enterprises.
How about you, Bonasio? You'd mentioned, some statistics about businesses that will shut down and how some of them will rebound. What do you think about the measures, the relief measures that have been put in place?
From what Dr. Mkisa said, and the government is actually limited. That notwithstanding, the redefining of the tax bands was a big welcome to most of the organizations and companies to be able to do a proper cost-cutting measures that were to be put in place. And other measures, including the VAT, being reducing that from 16% to 14%, that in itself had additional revenue that went into the organizations to be able to manage their operations. We might wanted to have to see more from the government, but I know there's a balance that they have to make to be able to make between debt servicing and debt management, including or financing of the government operations at any given time. What has been put in so far, including the COVID support to many of the, and this in terms of PPE's production by manufacturing firms, I think the economy has been vibrant enough. And what we appreciate is that inflation has not gone up, and that has been supported very well by agricultural production to some level, and level of economic activity that has been going on in the economy. So I think the measures may not have satisfied the full expectation of the common man, but at least they went a long way to be able to relieve the burden of the common man.
Right, and of course the contrast between the developed and the developing economies. I know Peter Hurst is still with us from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he talked about harnessing technology with respect to that, and also the role that non-state actors can play. I wonder, Peter, if you've got any thoughts on just some of the lessons that developing economies can learn from the post-COVID-19, in relation to issues like taxation and trade and healthcare. Which way post-COVID-19?
Thank you. So yeah, I think the thing I'd say about this is that we're currently still in a pandemic. I think what countries need to really consider is that, you know, they're managing different priorities here. They have to spend quite big in terms of meeting healthcare costs, and then they also need to think about stimulus. So I think there's certainly a timing issue here. So, you know, we've got the initial stage of the crisis whereby countries, if they can spend, that's what they need to be doing, or perhaps they need to be giving relief and protecting the vulnerable. I think that's particularly important. So I understand that Kenya has given relief or tax relief, as we've been talking about today. But I think the key thing is to make sure that that relief is targeted to those that most need it. And then I guess in the more medium term, what countries are going to have to think about is stimulus, because we've got economies which are quite decimated, and that's going to be very hard as well to then find more resources to be able to stimulate the economy. And then we're going to have to move into the recovery phase after that, where countries are going to find very big fiscal deficits, and especially there's going to be a challenge for revenue authorities to be able to find additional revenues to be able to help meet that fiscal gap. So I think my point is about timing, really. We need to kind of be reactive to the situation, to what's possible. You don't want to be taxing too early to be able to stifle the economy. You don't want to stimulate too early if your country's still in lockdown, because that will reduce the impact of the stimulus. So I think countries need to be flexible to react clearly and to find the fiscal space, if there is any, where they can find it.
Yeah, and I know, like you said, Peter, and I want to pose this question now to Ms. Lee, that, you know, we're still in the fog of it, if you like. Many countries across the world experiencing a second wave. Kenya is also just taking a look at, you know, an increase in the numbers, even when we thought we had this under control, expecting to hear perhaps a return to some tougher restrictions today from the president. But is it possible to look forward, Ms. Lee, and to just start to think of, you know, building scenarios to how we prepare for this in the future, how we build resilience, and what the role of taxation is in this? So I'll get that from Ms. Lee, and then as well from Mrs. Moduna on the role of taxation, you know, as we think forward. I know it can be a little tough right now, but maybe any thoughts as we close?
Yes, this is a very tough situation. It's not only in Kenya, around the world, there's a second wave. And however, human beings are very resilient. We learn from our mistakes and we adapt to the situations. So this is the same situation. And also we can also utilize the crisis as opportunity and to think about what can we do better. As Peter and also Marcio has noted that the countries can adapt and adjust their system, particularly in this period, to think about how to utilize the technology, digitalize your system. To some extent, country has done quite a lot, both in the tax administration and also in daily life. Like this conference, we were able to pull it off virtually. And also we know that when you want to do something, it always takes a long time to plan. So even though we are not not in a position to fully recover the tax administrations, but it is important to set the foundation in place so that the recovery can take place very quickly. And also because the pandemic is still ongoing, and country, whenever they have the resources, they should make sure not to withdraw the stimulus prematurely to choke the economy. Obviously, for a lot of countries, the developing countries, there's a huge tension to strike, the balance to strike between supporting the economy and avoid long-term risks, building up the long-term risks. And for that, as also noted by previous speakers, it is critical to prioritize and focus the resources on the priority areas and protect the most vulnerable population during this time period. I stop here.
Thank you. Madam Moduna, the role of taxation as we sort of try to build scenarios to ensure that we are better prepared next time.
Administrators, I think our role really is to enhance, programs that will lead to voluntary compliance, so that those who are in businesses still can pay their taxes, and the use of technology is important here. We should use technology to reach out or to capture all taxpayers as much as possible. And the other role that is important for us is to ensure that we expand, the base, the tax base, so that as many people, as many taxpayers as possible are brought in to share the burden. But I would perhaps ask those who are in the field, like Mohammed, if there's anything they want to add on that, they can add.
Okay.
Yeah. Mohammed,
yes. Can we get a mic to Mohammed? And then keep it brief. We have one last question to answer, and then we will conclude our session. Yeah.
Okay, I think during the COVID and post-COVID recovery, you cannot detach the fiscal planning, the tax planning, the role of tax from the wider economy. I think that's the first point. So from what we've heard from the panelists, there is the administrative part where we need to, even as a country, seal the loopholes of financial flows and the like. So that one will be there. And then there is the more policy side where we need to look at, as I said, you cannot detach from the wider economy. So I think there are plans to look at the post-COVID economic recovery, and therein there'll be fiscal measures in terms of now making sure that the tax we impose is in line with that kind of recovery. And I just want to add that incentives, we've seen there's a quest for incentives, and yet the kind of research we have seen, there's no single study that has said that tax expenditure generally actually is an incentive to FDI, for example, and investment. It ranks very low in terms of you want to make sure there's security, the capital market is working, you've got the fiscal space is okay. So in terms of ranking, what are the factors that investors look at? It is about number 12, number 13 in terms of the ranking. So I think it's about looking at those policies. And you've heard earlier today, the minister said in 2018, the total tax expenditure was 535 billion. And yet we don't see commensurate returns. So I think those are, there's administrative issues to seal the loophole, making sure that everybody is complying. Then there are policy issues that are in line with the wider economic recovery plan.
Indeed, thank you very much for that. Our last question today, and this is definitely something that's going to come up again and again. We had this quite vibrantly in the last session, but Dr. Kitui, I'll give you the opportunity to address this one. The question is, how do we address the issue of double taxation in the world of taxation of the digital economy across multinationals?
All right, there are three things about the debate on taxation and the digital economy. I'm a member of the Broadband Commission, and at our spring meeting in Silicon Valley at Facebook headquarters last year, we're confronting this question. How do you explain that the largest electronic digital platform companies make 80% of their profits abroad, but they pay more than 80% of their taxes at home? So just like in minerals and extractives with the digital economy, we must embrace the progressive principle that you pay your largest taxes where you make those profits, not where you are nominally registered. And this is the challenge the European Union brought to the European Court of Justice about Ireland negotiating preferential taxes to Google so that they set up their headquarters in Ireland. And the government was forced to demand taxes it had forgone to attract the company to have its headquarters there. So that's one. The second principle in taxation of multinationals is the main business of multinational platform companies is they access your data and they monetize it. So who owns the data? Who has the residual value in what is monetized? Is it those who digitalize your information or between them and you? So for the developing countries also, the issue that if it's our data that you are marketing and making a profit out of, we must share the proceeds of that data. The third product is the principle of electronic commerce. You know, the source countries of electronic commerce have been comfortable in pushing what in trade is called ad minimis. That, I mean, you customs people know this, that these are miscellaneous little things, just group them together, you don't have to go and split them together for purpose of taxation. But the reality is that they are pushing for a moratorium on taxing goods purchased online, which is taking away an important revenue stream for tax authorities, legitimate revenue stream for tax authorities, even when it is competing with locally produced comparable products. And finally, the taxation issue is the digital companies are one step ahead of regulators. How do we build a constant capacity and replenish the competencies of tax authorities to know when they're being cheated out of their money? I think that is the basic debate on digital company taxation issues.
Yep, definitely. You know, being in tandem with them and creating the capacity of the staff within the revenue administrations. Now we have our poll that we had set out. I just want to read the results of that, and then we have closing comments from all of our panelists. I'd like to just remind our panelists to do it in TV speak 1 minute. We often say that. Exactly 60 seconds. But first, the poll that we had put out today to our virtual audiences watching us from across the world, we asked you, have tax policy measures implemented been effective in mitigating the socio-economic effects of COVID-19? And you're a very optimistic lot today, which is good. 62% of you say yes, and 39% of you say no. So that's a good place. And really, like we said, we're in uncharted territory. So a lot of this is learn as we go. So this is also, you know, some good news to the governments, to the revenue administrations, that many of the policies that you put in place, 62% could be better. But listen, this is pretty good, I think, in this day and age. All right, I'd like us to then have the closing remarks. Can we begin with you, Ms. Lee, in just 60 seconds, your final words to us today?
Thank you very much. This is such an interesting topic and interesting session. And for the countries, the IMF advised that the country should not to withdraw the stimulus too early, but prepare early for the recovery. And so you have a plan ready, particularly a contingency plan to deal with the disruptive events. In addition, it's important to think about what's the opportunities this crisis provide in terms of utilizing technology and build a more resilient system, and so you can manage it better. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Marcio, ready? 60 seconds for your final thoughts.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, it was an honor for me to participate in this tax summit. To conclude, what I think I would say, like a joke, that maybe we should write our tax codes by pencil. What is important is to have in our mind that we need to review every day our tax codes, the tax laws, to adapt our tax codes to the reality. And the COVID crisis opened to us new opportunities to review old concepts and to introduce new tax base like the green tax, like the digital tax. And it's very important to try to be simple, to define easy legislations that developing countries could implement. And digital tax is one of them. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really, really enjoyed.
Thank you. And we really enjoyed your presentation as well. Keep it simple and be dynamic and be ready to change and think quickly on your feet. Peter Hurst, your final comment.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I completely support what Marcio's saying. I'd say that we need to continue to be innovative and find new ways to collect taxes and reinforce the old ways too. Digital taxes, engaging civil society, and then most importantly, be positive about the future, because we can get through this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Being collaborative, civil society, non-state actors. Edwin?
I think from my side is just to be able to say the pandemic has just really provided opportunities. It has stretched us to a new way of doing things. We have to be innovative. We have to look at things from a different lens. And that means even from a tax perspective, a lot is expected in terms of innovation. We need to be able to build the trust. The trust deficit must be narrowed. And maybe I didn't talk about that, to be able to come up with a tax governance report that can be issued to the common man to be able to understand how the taxes and where the taxes went. With this, we'll be able to rebuild and regenerate the economy in the sense that we need to be able to provide the incentives, yes, but we need the much-needed revenue to be able to run this country. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's a great idea, particularly from the man who pioneered the Financial Reporting Awards. So it might be something to think about with the tax governance report, building trust. Susan, your final thoughts in a minute?
Thank you, and thank you everybody for participating in this forum. I think my comment would be that for us as KRA, our duty really as tax administrators is to make sure that we deliver on some of these measures that we are taking, administrative measures that we are taking to mitigate against the risks that COVID-19 has brought into this economy. And just to ensure that businesses are protected and that taxpayers are voluntarily compliant going forward. And at the same time, ensure that we do work with the policymakers to make sure that the policies that are channeled out are friendly to everybody in the economy.
Thank you. Yeah. Finally, Daktari?
The Kenya Revenue Authority for being an example we use a lot in comparing African revenue authorities. But don't be complacent for being seen as among the best on this continent. But principally, I want to say this. There is no point where COVID ends and recovery begins. The world, after the shock of the first 2 quarters of the year, moved into dealing with the health pandemic and health economic recovery at the same time. Already results are out in China and Vietnam, which grew 8 to 10% in the second quarter of this year, the best example in the world. The challenge now is how can we innovatively expand the dragnet, but also, apart from looking at sourcing revenue, those who appropriate the revenue should see the priorities are about recovery, not any grandiose dreams that they want to build.
Indeed, and I really like that. Combating the pandemic and thinking recovery at the same time. I don't think we have the luxury to go through one phase and then wait for that to be done and then start thinking and planning for recovery. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all my panelists this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I do like the fact that, again, We heard from ladies. I'm a big champion of gender parity, if you can't already tell from this morning. It was really good to hear from all of you, and thank you for your final words that ring true. As you've already seen, we're starting to look to the future with this afternoon session, and it's definitely something that we will continue to do in tomorrow's session. Like we said, we've got panelists and audiences from across the country. So this is the Kenya Revenue Authority bringing together representatives from across the continent. Would like to thank all our participants and our audiences. We've had participation from over 20 African countries. We've had representation from Europe, from the United States, and from South America as well, as you've seen in this panel. So tomorrow, as we're casting our eye forward, we will start to look at revenue administration in Africa, on the continent. We will share experiences on how they are collecting revenue and increasing that, particularly in the space we find ourselves in with the pandemic. How are other revenue authorities doing during COVID-19, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa? We'll also be focusing quite a bit on South-to-South cooperation and how that can work. We know that global supply chains have been severely disrupted during this time. So beyond the taxation measures, also a very key factor and function of revenue authorities is facilitation of trade. And so what is the use of digital technology and artificial intelligence, in that respect? We've got staff who are at the border points. I think we've seen some customs officials who are here. We recognize you, we see you, thank you. We'll be talking about that tomorrow, sharing the African experience and, of course, seeing what worked for others, what challenges they had, and how they were able to mitigate them as we look forward to working together to strengthening our resilience and our revenue mobilization, not just here in Kenya, but across the continent. I would like to finally thank you for all of your interaction. We've got some great questions. And I'd just like to mention that for a hybrid function such as this one, we are extremely thankful to the close to 800 participants that we had on Zoom. Can we give a round of applause to that and for our members? We were at about 780 and have averaged 700 throughout the day. So we thank you. And this means that the message is going further. Remember to continue the conversation today and through tomorrow. Tax Summit 2020 is the hashtag. We will continue with that. Tomorrow we begin once again bright and early at 9 o'clock. So please make sure you log in at 8:45. And also for those who are sitting here, 8:45, 8:30 would be even better so we can get to settle in. And I want to thank you who are here for also practicing social distancing, keeping your masks on, and sanitizing. It is important to remember to stay safe at this time. I would like to thank you all, wishing you a good afternoon and a good evening ahead. For those of us who are joining us from the United States, it's a good day to you as you continue to monitor the situation in your country with the election that the whole world is watching at this time. So thank you to everybody. My panelists, before you leave, we would like to remember this moment. So if you could just, I will step out of the way, and then we'll just have you stand here for a very quick picture. It'll only take a few minutes. Please indulge me on that one. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a good evening. Asanteni. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.